Hello there. This one is called My Curious Relationship with Heat and Cold. And these are things that affect us all, of course they do. So I'm going to give you an insight into how it is for me. So I find that with heat, my body starts to relax. And when my body relaxes, my mind starts to become more open and more relaxed. And I feel on every level of my being, sense of comfortable, feeling good, well-being, and loving it. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, my experience of cold is exactly the opposite. So I find that what happens when I'm in a situation of cold, I contract, I tense up, I'm much more likely to experience anxiety or agitation. And in short, I feel terrible. Now, this is something that I've been aware of for a very long time, and it's something I've been working with throughout my life. And there actually is a point where this all originates. And that's the thing about shamanism. With shamanism, we're always looking at root causes. And my root causes go way, way back. But before I get into any of that, I just want to say a little bit more about heat and cold. Because what I've noticed is that other people find this quite strange. And just to give you an idea, I have spent a lot of time living in caravans, yurts, benders, geodesic domes, a broad gaff cutter, which is a wooden boat, all sorts of different homes. And I actually find the most challenging of all homes is the one I'm in right now, which is the bricks and mortar or the stone with the central heating, that kind of thing. I find these the most troubling and the most awkward for me. And I find that generally speaking, either I'm in a hot country, in which case it's like, yeah, or I'm occupying a relatively small space, because it's a total no-brainer when you think about it. If you occupy a small space, you can heat it very much quicker than you can a big space. So I had a recent experience about this, being invited to spend time over Christmas in a large space with a large heater. And I thought, well, let's see how it goes. So here's something else I want to explain to you. If you have issues with cold like I do, the first thing I want to make clear is I developed a long time ago what I call my exit strategy. So if I've put myself into a situation where I'm likely to experience cold, I make sure that I've got a way to warm up. And this is what I've tended to find. So this is going to seem like a bit of a digression, but it's all part of the same subject, because I was invited to explore what it's like to have what I call water experiences. People call it wild swimming. It's an inaccurate term because there's many different ways you can experience water at its ambient temperature. In a cold country, that means cold water. And you may swim. It may not be a large enough body of water for you to swim. So I call it still the water experience. I've had many of these. And in 2000, I was invited to have my first one by having a choice. I was staying with my sister-in-law. I could either go to the room downstairs and get a bowl and wash in a bowl, or I could go outside and walk about 300 yards to where the waterfall was. Pristine, beautiful river water, so inviting. I rapidly discovered it's actually one of the coldest waters I've ever been immersed in my life, barring two exceptions. However, I still did it. I threw myself into the experience. Now, by this point, I'd done quite a lot of work on myself. Well, in fact, I've been working on myself for 10 years by that point. And what I mean by that, I've been going to work individually with therapists on my own and in group therapy situations to attempt to understand what makes me tick and why I am the way that I am, and why that I have issues in certain areas of being alive that other people don't have. So that's the important thing just to clarify there. Now, the thing is, when I was a child, I got exposed to something which people today would call water torture. And basically, as a young child, I was immersed into a body of cold water. And each time it was done, I had no choice. It was being something that was forced upon me. It was actually being done to condition me. And I'll just make a little digression here. Torture is not done to people to find out information. This is one of the misinformations that is on all of the entertainment media. How many times you've seen someone being tortured, especially in a spy film, to obtain information? That's not why torturing is done. It's done for a completely different reason. It's actually done to condition the person into a state of blind obedience, which is why it's being done to me. So in that experience, I was subjected to being immersed in cold water, forced to have this experience, and each time it was done I went in for longer, and that was a part of the conditioning. So I would literally be unable to breathe, have to hold my breath and hold my breath and hold my breath until I was pulled out. It was utterly horrific to be a young child and experience such things. So this actually is one of my fundamental anchors to do with cold, which is why I'm mentioning it. But this is the one that happened around about age 10. It's not the first. So here's the thing. What I can say is this. When I took that opportunity in 2001 to get into the waterfall, it was a huge shock, and I discovered the beautiful thing that happens to people when they are subjected to cold water experiences. This is by choice, of course, now, which is that first of all you get the blood pressure drop. There's the initial extreme shock of the temperature being so cold. Then what your body does is your blood pressure rises, a huge amount of endorphins, including oxytocin, are released, and you feel like $1 million. And after that, you get out, you dry off, and it's all good. Right, so this was one of my fundamental negative anchors. Now this one I actually began to transform in 2001 because I chose to do something that was done to me against my will when I was 10 years old. I then was able to slowly transform my relationship with that situation. And this comes back to the exit strategy. My exit strategy is as follows. After immersion in cold water, I may or may not have a smoke, but what is absolutely guaranteed is within the hour, I will be in a very warm space. If I can't arrange that, I simply won't do it. And of course, there's a problem with when I was a child, because I was subjected to experiences and there was no warm space to go back to. So you can begin to see one of the reasons why I have this curious relationship with heat and cold. I have a very, very strong anchor, a negative anchor, to do with trauma, to do with dissociative identity disorder, which means that if I get subjected to cold, it affects me in a completely different way than for people who have not been traumatized in this manner. Well, I thought that was it until I was doing my writing out processes, which I did do in 2023, which took me 3 months. And that's when I actually found myself writing out about my birth, and I discovered for the first time how I was born. It was a time of great poverty in England. It wasn't poverty in terms of individual people's houses. The whole country was in poverty to such an extent they couldn't afford to heat buildings the way they needed to. And one of the casualties of my dad, he got tuberculosis being an aircraft apprentice because his building wasn't adequately heated. So he got a chronic illness as a result, which he managed to get cured, which is great. So my first experience was being born. The hospital, it was very, very cold and very, very bright. So my first experience of being alive on this planet was having the fundamental shock of the coldness. And despite everything that was done, obviously my mother did her best, but she was incredibly cold too. The entire environment she was in, the hospital, was terribly cold. So I've actually got two very powerful negative anchors. Now I've managed to transform the first one because I can get into cold water feel the horror of the first 3 seconds, realize that there's all this stuff going on in my body, get the blood pressure drop, get the blood pressure rise, get all the endorphin release, the oxytocin and so on, and feel like $1 million. So I've really done great work on that one. However, my first experience of being born remains. And so this is why I have my exit strategy, because I don't ever put myself in a situation where I won't be able to warm up. And I've discovered through trial and error, I've got a window of about an hour. So I can be cold, the cold stops, I can put the clothes on, do what I can, and then I have to find that place. And if I find that place and warm up, everything is fine. It doesn't take me very long at all, and I don't have any severe issues to deal with. If this doesn't happen to me, what happens is as follows. I start to lose interest in my environment. My brain function starts to diminish and starts to become slower. I feel sluggish. I start to lose interest in being alive. I start to become very depressed, and I feel like I cannot bear existing. It's a fundamental Hamlet, Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question kind of moment. That is what happens if I ever get exposed to cold for more than a certain length of time. I simply do not want to be alive. And if I reach that point and I get put into a place where I can heat up, it doesn't get rectified straight away. It takes quite a considerable period of time to bring my body temperature up and to start to work with a warm body on my emotional and psychological and mental state. And it can take up 24 hours when that's the case. So you can imagine I'm usually incredibly careful to avoid any situation where I cannot control the temperature I'm in. And just to show you what a big thing it was for me in my life, for a lot of years I used to live in static caravans, yurts, all those structures I talk about, benders, all the rest of it, all with wood burning stove, coal burning stove in the boat, small space, get heated up really quickly, everything's fine. Well, I did gradually become aware of how weird this was because of the way other people respond. They'd come and visit me, and I remember particularly my daughter and some other people, they'd come and visit me. After a little while they'd open the door of the caravan or the structure and poke their head outside and take big gulps of air because they found it too hot. So I'm aware a lot of people find the temperatures I love to be too hot for them. I really do get that. But here's the thing I discovered, and it was purely because of living where the Octagon now is. Before there was an Octagon, there was a static caravan. I was living in there. There was a Rayburn. A caravan with a Rayburn, that is my idea in living in England as paradise, because I know that a Rayburn will always make me warm enough. Well, I can remember eventually getting a cheap thermometer from one of the pound shops. And I can remember I used to look at the temperature at different times of the day and the evening. And when I was at Middlewood, I did the same thing too. And I noticed a constant phenomenon where nobody else was there giving me their opinions. My temperature, which I had for default, was 40.5 degrees centigrade, which actually is pretty darn hot. So I do agree. I've been outside in Spain at 40 degrees centigrade in the sun. It's quite something. But it's also quite something in the caravan, which I've done. And what I discovered is that 40.5 degrees centigrade is exactly the temperature that the Park Atwood Anthroposophical Medicine Clinic in Shropshire in England uses to cure people of cancer. Cancer cells can't take it. When the human body gets to that temperature for that long enough, it literally causes them to fail to function and they die. So isn't that peculiar? I was so surprised to discover that fact. I don't need to be at 40.5 degrees centigrade anymore. I've done so much work on myself over so many years. And to be honest, if I go into my kitchen now in the house and it's 22 degrees, that's just over half of what it used to be. It's like I'm I'm jumping up and down, I'm singing, it's fantastic. If it's 18 degrees or less, I've gone back into utter abject misery mode, brain starting to shut down and not really able to function. So I found it such a crucial thing for me. 18 degrees or below, that's when I start to suffer. And if I'm anything below 15, I'm seriously up shit creek. That's how it is. So there's something I want to add to all this. I knew it had to come up. What about your plant medicine retreats then? Ah, well, yes. The thing is, I have listened to people who've been on retreats with the plant medicines, most especially the brown medicine, and I've listened to them and they've told me I went on this retreat in such and such a place and there wasn't enough heating and I got cold and it was absolutely terrible. I wasn't able to make any spiritual progress on my journey. I was completely blocked, and they heard that from more than one source. And I'm talking about people whose bodies have a lot more fat on them than I do. This is one, of course, of my fundamental issues. I'm walking around with a body with so little fat on, and that just is how I am. I've done many, many things to attempt to put on weight, and none of them have worked. So I now completely accept my weight as it is. It's fine. It's just I'm much more sensitive to the cold. But when I realised that people who don't have my issue with the cold actually got into a real mess working with these plant medicines in an environment that was too cold, I knew that when I started to do my work, I would have to make sure that I provided a very warm space indeed. And the great thing that I always say about people in England, if you're in England, you're in someone's space and it's too warm, do you know what you need to do? Go outside or go away from the stove, sit by the door. It's so obvious, it's such a no-brainer, but I actually once had someone in my yurt sitting next to the wood-burning stove complaining, I'm too hot, I'm too hot. Well, you know what I said to her because I just said it to you. So common sense, isn't it? If you're in a cold country and there's a warm space and there are people enjoying the heat, you know what you can do. Take a breather, get out, go and do something different, but don't give the person who's actually starting to relax and feel wonderful 7 grades of hell for being who they are. Because up until this time, this is who I am, and I've got my 2 fundamental triggers. The one to do with cold water, I've pretty much nailed it, so I can go to the White Spring when I choose to and have a fantastic experience. But I make very sure that if I'm in a cold place, I always have my exits chastely organised, which practically speaking either means my car, which I can make hot in about 10 minutes, or my own home, or somewhere else I can go. A classic combination that people experience, the sauna or sweat lodge and the ice cold water plunge pool. And of course in the far north they have these holes they make in the ice. I would love that, that's fantastic, and I've done the equivalent but not with the ice, but I have rolled in the snow on the retreat in the Octagon. That was a great thing to do. You're in a really lovely warm space, you go out, you preferably remove your clothes, you roll in the snow, make you feel like more than $1 million. Rolling in the snow is even better than immersing in cold water, I find. And then when you're done, back inside, back to the heat. So there you go. That is my story, my experience about heat and cold. All the love to you.